So today I want to share with you how to make a pattern custom fit to your measurements for a set of stays. I'm going to show you a basic pattern to make just a simple set of stays like this with nothing really going on except for some simple boning and this classic shape. But you can also use this pattern to make other types of stays like 18th century stays like this or like this, and pretty much you just need to change the waistline shapes or the neckline depending on what style you're going for, but this is a good foundation pattern for all of your different types of stays no matter what decade you're in. And this is not like totally historically accurate stays, but this is how I make all of my stays patterns. And if you just tweak it a little bit to make the right neckline shape or the right waistline shape depending on what era you're going for, then it doesn't really matter how historically accurate it is, it'll still provide the same shape and silhouette that is known for that time period. If you're a stickler about doing things the historically accurate way, then this might not be the best tutorial for you, but if you just want a pair of stays that looks close enough to the real thing, then you're gonna like this. My technique of doing this pattern is based off of Janet Arnold's Patterns of Fashion. This is the one specifically for making stays and bodices and things like that. If you're not familiar with this book, it's a really, really great asset to have as any costume maker. It has all these great reference photos in here of extant samples of stays and bodices and such. It also has more detailed diagrams in it and goes really into some of the construction details that they used back then. I really love it because at the back it describes a method for making a pair of stays, how they would have done it. It's a little bit hard to understand it from this book, but my method is based on this, so if you just follow my method, then it's pretty close to how they used to do it back then, which is really cool. There's a lot of other resources out there for making a pattern for a set of stays, so if you don't like my method, you could definitely check those out, but I've been using this method for ever since the beginning of starting my corset company, so I hope that you find this useful and at least as a good starting point for making your own. So you'll need a few things for this before you get started. You'll need some sort of patterning paper, or if you don't have that, then you can just tape regular pieces of paper together, or another common method is to use like a paper grocery bag. Anything works. You just need some sort of paper that is big enough for you to draw your shapes on. You'll also need a ruler, a pencil, scissors, just your regular patterning supplies, and then you'll need your measurements. So the measurements you're going to need are your bust, your underbust, your waist, and then you'll also need your length measurement, which is your apex to waist at side, and then your apex to waist along your bust, which I have instructions for on my website if you don't know how to take those, but those are very important for making sure that you get the length right on your corset. So without further ado, let's get to it. So to get started, we need to do a little bit of math. So we'll start with our measurements. As I mentioned, we need our bust, our underbust, our waist, and then our torso length measurements, which are our apex to waist along bust, and then apex to waist at side. So I'm going to use my measurements for this example, but you would use your own measurements in this case. So my measurements are 31.5 inches. My bust is 27.5 inches, and my waist is 25.5. My apex to waist along bust is 7.5, and my apex to waist at side is 7. These are all in inches, by the way. If you know centimeters, then this will be a lot easier for you, but for us inches folks, this is going to be a little bit tougher in the math department. So these are our body measurements. And naturally you want the corset to be a little bit smaller than your measurements. How much smaller you want it depends entirely up to you, and it also depends on your size. Some people are squishier than other people and like to have their stays tightened a lot more. So if you've never worn a set of stays before, or if you're not sure how much smaller to make the stays, then you can just go with my recommendations, which are pretty modest. And if you find that you want to make your stays tighter after this, then you would just change these numbers. So the rules that I like to use for my own body are I like to make the bust 4 inches smaller, the underbust 3 inches smaller, and the waist 3 inches smaller. I typically don't do these measurements for the other stays that I pattern for customers, but for me, this is what my body likes in particular. And this is based on how much squish factor I have in my own body. I have a small bust, so I like to get as much squishing in the bust area as possible. And my underbust and my waist aren't quite as squishy, that's why I'm not doing it as much. So it's totally okay for these to be different measurements. And the way to determine what works for you is to do a mock-up of your pattern once you get this all put together, and then you can decide if you want it to go tighter or looser. So what are we going to do with these measurements? We are going to subtract these from our body measurements to get our corset pattern measurements. So 31 and a half minus 4 is going to be 27 and a half. 27 and a half minus 3 is going to be 24 and a half. And 25 and a half minus 3 is going to be 22 and a half. The length measurements are not going to change at all because those don't get squished down. Your length never changes. Another thing worth mentioning is I have a pretty long torso, so if this measurement looks really long to you compared to yours, don't worry. A normal measurement is around 6, I think, for your apex to waisted side, but my torso tends to be a bit longer. So these are the finished measurements of our pattern, but we're going to be making only half of a pattern, and then you would cut it on the fold, or you would cut 2 of each piece when you're actually making the pattern. But for patterning purposes, we're only making half of the body. So to go forward from here, we're going to have to get what half is of these measurements. So if you have a lot of ½ inches or 1/4 inches in your measurements, then this is going to be a little bit more difficult, but you can just use a calculator if you need, and we're going to write that down here. So half of 27 and a half is 13 3/4, and half of 24 and a half is 12 and a half. Half of 22 and a half is 11 1/4. This is 1/4 as well. Oops. Okay. So these are the measurements that we're going to make our corset. So let's take a look at our finished sample real quick to determine what we are working with. So we're going to be making this shape essentially. To do this, everything that we pattern is going to be based off of the center of the side panel to start with. So first you're just going to draw a line somewhat in the middle of your paper. You want to give yourself enough room on this side and this side for the front and back of your pattern. So this right here is the center of our waist right here, and I'm actually going to pattern the stays this way. So this is going to be the basic shape when it's done. So this is the very center of the pattern at our side panel, and then we need to draw 2 lines for our bust and our waist. So I'm just going to draw a line to start and not worry about the measurement, and this will be my bust line. Next, you're going to take your apex to waist at side measurement, so -7, and I'm going to measure down 7 inches from this bust line to get my waist. And make sure that these lines are perpendicular here to this line. So this is my waist. So next we need to determine the length of this line. So my total measurement here is going to be 13 3/4. That is going to be the total length of my bust line. So I want to divide that somewhat evenly along the front and the back, except you have to remember that when you're patterning stays, there's going to be a gap in the back here. So you do want the front to be slightly larger than the back. So this is where it gets a little confusing, but bear with me. So my measurement is 13 3/4. And I need to determine what the front length is going to be and then what the back length is going to be. So to do that, I'm going to take half of 13 3/4, which is 6 7/8.
and I want there to be about an inch difference between the front and the back. So to get that, I'm going to add a ½ inch to this measurement to get the front, and then subtract ½ inch to get the back. So 6 7/8 plus a ½ inch is 7 3/8, and then 6 7/8 minus ½ inch is going to be 6 3/8. So you can see that there is an inch difference between these two. So now we're going to take one of these measurements. We'll start with our front, 7 3/8, and we're going to plot that here. So starting from your side seam and measuring this way, this is going to be the front over here. I'm going to measure 7 3/8. And you can either measure 6 3/8 from here, or you can just measure from this point your total length, which is 13 3/4. Either one should give you the exact same placement. Okay, so now I've got my center front point, and this is my center back point back here. I also need to do the same thing for the waist measurement. My waist is 11 1/4. So we need to take half of that, which would be 5 5/8. So adding a ½ inch to that is going to give you 6 1/8, and subtracting a ½ inch from this, or subtracting an inch from this, is going to give you 5 1/8. So we'll do the same thing with these measurements to plot our waist. And my total line length is 11 1/4.
Next thing we're going to do is connect these two lines. So here's my bust. I'm going to connect it with my waist. And that is going to create my temporary center front line. And then I'll do the same thing with the back. And that's my temporary center back line. So we want to add a little bit of a curve to this, and to do that I'm going to start with the waist. I just want it to have sort of a nice curve shape, and I'm just kind of estimating this. I'm sure there's some way to technically calculate this out, but I'm just kind of eyeballing it, and you know, this isn't really more than, it's going to be about 3/4 down from this point. And in fact, you want to make sure that this is a squared off line. So I have this going perpendicular to my center front. And you can take your French curve to draw that in. So I actually ended up shortening it a little bit. Mine's more like 5/8 of an inch down. But really just take your curve, if you have one, and just draw what looks like a nice curved shape. You don't want it to be too dramatic. But I think between a ½ inch and an inch is kind of the ballpark where you want to be. So now that I've done that, I've actually changed the length of my waistline. So if I measure this, my original line was 6 1/8. And if I measure my new line, it's not that dramatic on mine. It's 6 1/16. But if you have a larger waist measurement, then you'll notice more of a difference here. So I'm just going to adjust this. I'm going to add a 1/16 there. And I know a 1/16 doesn't seem like that much, but over the course of the pattern, it'll end up being about a ½ inch too small if you don't factor in that extra 1/16. So now that I have this line, this is going to be my new center front point. And I also need to recalculate the distance between my waist and my bust. So when we took our measurements, we got two torso length measurements. We got our apex to waist at side and our apex to waist at bust. So this is where the bust one is going to come in. So my measurement was 7.5. So I'm going to measure up from my new waistline, 7.5 inches. And that way I'm transferring the same curved shape over to my bust. And make sure you square that line off again. And now you have the front part of your pattern. Pretty much the foundation is there. So we need to repeat and do the same thing to the back. So I'm going to copy this amount of curve that I went down here. It was 5/8. And I'm going to redraw that curved line. And then when I'm doing the back here, I'm not going to use my apex to waist at bust measurement because in the back you don't have a bust. So we're actually just going to use our apex to waist at side measurement. And if you have a sway back, or if you know that your back torso length happens to be shorter than your side, then you can make this shorter. But in my case, it's the same, so I'm going to use this measurement, 7 inches. So it should be the same as what you did here. And square off that line. And draw your new curve shape. And then again, we're going to recheck that measurement. Here mine was 6 3/8. And on this side, it's actually a whole 1/8 of an inch smaller because this curve is a little bit more dramatic than this one. So now I have my new center front and center back points plotted out. I'm going to get rid of this old line. And I'm going to draw a new line for my center front and center back. And actually, I never reshaped this curve. Okay, so those are the final shapes for my center front and center back. And now everything else is basically just style lines. So you could make this into a corset, essentially. But I want to make a little bit of a dramatic waist shape, and then I want to do a little bit of a neckline thing, and I want this to have straps, so I'm going to add some style lines in the back for straps, but pretty much this is your foundation, and you can do whatever you want based off of this. So I'm just going to draw a little curved waist shape here, and then I'll do the same for here. Just make sure you square off your lines. Okay, and I just kind of drew these by eye, and you can do that as well. And basically you're going to want to do a mock-up fitting with this pattern, and then you can really determine what style you want the waistline and the neckline to be. You can even add a little bit more fabric here if you're not sure of how you want this to be. So maybe this neckline is a little bit too low for you, or you want it to go lower. You can do that all in the pattern fitting. So this is pretty much it. The last thing I want to do is add some seams. So on my pattern here, I have a seam here and a seam here. And on a traditional set of stays, I think there's 4 pieces, but for my purposes, I kind of like to make it simpler for me, so I just do 3. And the style lines kind of go something like this. So they're a little bit slanted. You can also just, cut out this basic shape and then draw on your mock-up sample where you want these style lines to go. But this is just kind of like based on what was the style for that era, or where you want specifically there to be more support or taking things in. I'm actually going to make this a little bit more slanted. It creates more of a V shape when it's on the body that way. So I'll get rid of this line. And one of the main reasons that I like to add these style lines in is so that I can do some shaping under these pieces as well. And I don't know if this is totally the historically accurate way of doing things. I think that in historically accurate patterns, they do some of that underbust shaping in the center front piece, but I like this to be a nice straight seam, so I'm not going to touch that. And this is totally optional too, because stays are typically very conically shaped, so you won't really have a lot of shaping in the underbust, but I like to add a little bit of shaping there to add more support for the bust. So my underbust measurement is going to be 24.5, and like I determined, the half of that is 12 1/4. So to do that, I'm just going to roughly eyeball where my underbust is and draw a line. You can determine that by measuring your bust and seeing how far away from your apex is your underbust. So mine's about 2.5, and just roughly drawing this line, just mimicking the same curve. And then I'm going to do a little measurement here along this curve to see what that measurement ends up being. So I'm getting 13, and my goal was to get 12 1/4. So that means I want to take roughly 3/4 away from this. So I have 4 sides here to work with to take away 3/4. So I might do it like this, where I have a little bit more shaping at the side front seam and a little less in the back, since this area is more curved. So kind of right where that underbust point is where I'm going to take some sizing away. So here I'm going to do 1/4 and 1/4. That adds up to be about 1/2 inch. And then over here I'm going to do 1/8 and 1/8. And then that is 1/4 inch. So with those two, that gets me my 3/4 that I'm subtracting away from the 13 inches. And that'll leave me with my underbust measurement, which is 12 1/4. So now I'm just going to do a little bit of reshaping to my seam lines. I typically do it on one side, and then I will mirror it on the other side. So here's my basic shape, and I'm ready to get this cut out. So now that I've got this piece cut out and I have that seam line the way I want it to be, I'm just going to place it here and align it. And then trace that same shape on this side. Okay, so we've got our 3 pattern pieces here, and before you go any further, you probably want to label these. So I'm just labeling mine center front, side, and center back. And then you'll also want to draw your grain lines on, which is really simple. For the center back, your grain line is going to be parallel to this line that we drew. And then the same thing for the center front. It'll be parallel to center front. And then for the side, we're going to use our original line that we drew for our side seam grain line. So the pattern is basically finished. This is a good block, but keep in mind that this doesn't have any seam allowance on it. So you will need to add that in if you're going to make something out of this. And I recommend first trying out this pattern, doing a mock-up sample, and then making sure that you like all of your waistline shapes and your neckline shapes. And then once you get a pattern that you're really happy with, then you add the seam allowance in. But for now, this is a great foundation for us. And if you look at our original reference sample, you can see that it's quite similar. This one is not made to my measurements, so it's not going to be exactly the same, but you can see the general shape is very similar. And as far as the boning placement goes, it really depends on what style you're making, how boned you want it to be, and where you want there to be more or less support. So that's another thing that you can determine when you're doing a mock-up fitting. And I generally like to do a lot of boning in the center front and then some additional boning where the bust area is to really provide support for the bust, and then it's more lightly boned in the back. You can see that better on here too. And if you're adding a strap to your stays, then that's something that you can also do when you do a fitting of this. You know, I just kind of roughly drew a strap shape here so that I could add a strap on, but you can just kind of come up with the shape yourself, determine what length that you like by measuring it on your body once you have the mock-up on. One more thing I really recommend if you're going to do a mock-up is to make yourself a set of these. So this is basically just a strip of fabric I took and I put grommets in it. They're equally spaced apart, and the idea is that if you've got your pattern cut out of fabric, you can just baste this on to your fabric without having to punch holes into it, and then you can actually do a fitting the proper way by trying this on and getting it all laced up properly without having to guess, because remember, this will be smaller than your measurements, so you won't be able to just pin it to yourself like you normally would. So take the extra step and make a pair of these and thank me later. And just looking at a different style than the simple one, this is a set of 18th century stays I made, and you can see that the pattern shapes are pretty similar. It's just this one's got all these little waist frillies added to it, whereas our original pattern didn't. So that's something that you can do just by drawing the lines and seeing how you like the style. And you can also change the neckline shape in the same way. So really the world is your oyster when it comes to making stays now that you've got your foundation set. So I hope you found this useful. I would love to know if you end up trying out this pattern and what you come up with. Do let me know if you have any questions. I'd be happy to answer them, especially with some of the math parts. I know it's a little bit confusing to explain, but once you try it out, then it really becomes a simple formula and you can end up with a great foundation pattern for making pretty much any set of stays that you ever could want in the world. So happy sewing. Let me know how it goes.